When King Charles fell gravely ill, the palace fell into a tense and uneasy silence. But behind that silence, a quiet war was brewing, one that would pit two of the most powerful women in the monarchy against each other. Catherine, known for her grace and composure, suddenly found herself thrust into a dark power struggle she never asked for but could no longer avoid. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The moment the news of the king's health crisis reached the public, a strange calm fell over the monarchy. Official statements called for privacy and patience, yet something behind those carefully chosen words didn't sit right. The vacuum left by Charles's absence wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. With the throne momentarily stilled, the gears of ambition began to turn in dangerous directions. Amidst the uncertainty, Catherine rose not by command, but by presence. While others stumbled in confusion, she embodied the steady heart of the royal institution, attending public events, comforting shaken citizens, and reassuring the country that stability endured. The press hailed her as the unspoken regent, the steady hand guiding the ship through the storm. But inside the palace walls, it was a different story. Behind the scenes, unsettling murmurs began to reach Catherine. Whispers of Camilla's quiet readiness echoed through staff corridors and private courtyards. At first, Catherine dismissed them as idle gossip, fear-induced paranoia. But then the patterns emerged. The Queen Consort was suddenly everywhere, giving speeches she hadn't been scheduled for, requesting briefings from departments she rarely oversaw, and increasing her contact with senior courtiers who had long remained politically neutral. These weren't coincidences, they were coordinated movements, and Catherine knew enough about the inner workings of power to recognize the signs of a campaign in motion. Her instincts, honed over years of navigating royal life, began to scream. Something was off. Every smile Camilla offered now seemed rehearsed, every public appearance strategic. It was as if she were rehearsing for a role she hadn't been offered, but desperately intended to claim. The idea was unthinkable, and yet, not impossible. Catherine knew ambition when she saw it. And this wasn't the ambition of a consort happy to support from the sidelines. This was something darker, something urgent. Then came the messages, subtle, indirect, but damning. A long-time palace assistant quietly passed Catherine a folder of notes hinting at discussions she had never been informed of. An old friend from a foreign office alerted her to Camilla's name being floated in private diplomatic briefings. A trusted media ally shared that a royal source had begun feeding them narratives, positioning Camilla as the only stable figure in the current crisis. It was as if someone had lit a match, and the flame was crawling up the walls of Windsor, threatening to ignite the entire monarchy. Catherine's hands trembled, but not from fear, from clarity. This wasn't speculation anymore. It was a plot. And if it succeeded, the monarchy wouldn't just shift, it would shatter. But nothing could prepare Catherine for the documents. She would soon uncover documents that would shake the very pillars of the monarchy. In a dimly lit corridor of Clarence House, a confidential dossier slipped into Catherine's hands. What it revealed was more than ambition. It was a fully orchestrated power play by Queen Camilla, complete with secret meetings, manipulated courtiers, and a chilling timeline to seize the throne, all while Charles lay vulnerable. The file wasn't thick, but every page inside it pulsed with calculated intent. It had been left on her private desk, unsigned, untraceable, but the message was unmistakable. Look deeper. Inside were names, dates, summaries of hushed meetings that never appeared on any official schedule. Catherine sat frozen as she flipped through pages marked with the initials of senior political advisors, private parliamentary counsel, and select members of the House of Lords. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't rumour, it was infrastructure. A silent campaign quietly threading itself through the heart of the monarchy. One entry stood out immediately, a recurring list of meetings between Camilla and a retired constitutional law expert who had previously advised during the late Queen's succession revisions. On paper, it was framed as informal consultation. But when Catherine traced the calendar patterns, the dots began connecting. Camilla was quietly building the legal foundation to request emergency regency powers, not merely as a placeholder, but as a sovereign figure in all but name, and she was doing it while Charles remained sedated under strict medical supervision. Catherine's hands trembled again. This time not with fear, but fire. It was betrayal. Not just against Charles, but against everything the crown was meant to protect. Buried deeper in the file were messages exchanged between Camilla's personal aide and several senior aides in key government positions. These weren't casual communications. They were directives, coordination memos. Camilla's people were instructing officials to prepare the transition narrative and streamline the media framing around leadership assurance. It was all coded, all indirect, but unmistakable in its intent, and the timing wasn't random. Each move aligned perfectly with Charles's deteriorating condition. The sicker he became, the bolder Camilla's team grew. Elevate her visibility. Embed her name in the lexicon of stability. Appearances were made with the quiet endorsement of palace veterans who had long known how to play the game of optics. They moved fast, reshuffling departments, installing loyalists into advisory positions, even removing junior staff known to favor William and Catherine. It wasn't brute force, it was precision. A silent cleansing of dissent. What chilled Catherine most wasn't the ambition, it was the narrative being prepared. Camilla wasn't going to present this as a grab for power. She was going to claim it was for the good of the nation, that the people needed continuity, that someone had to lead. And because Charles couldn't, she would. Not with defiance, but with noble sacrifice. It was a script rehearsed down to the final line, and Catherine had read the entire act. By the time she closed the folder, Catherine knew. This wasn't court maneuvering. It wasn't personal rivalry. It was a coup in slow motion, cloaked in velvet and pearls. And as Catherine pieces together the conspiracy, she begins to realize Camilla wasn't acting alone. Behind the king's back, a quiet rebellion was forming, and some of its members weren't. Strangers to Charles. Longtime friends, former confidants, and even senior staff had begun shifting allegiances. What Catherine found next would make her question everyone, even those closest to her. The signs were subtle at first: missed calls, delayed updates, and odd glances exchanged across corridors. Catherine had expected the weight of Charles's illness to test the limits of protocol, but she hadn't anticipated the speed with which loyalty would fracture. In meetings once defined by deference, she now sensed calculation. A growing number of voices began to echo a single phrase: stability, and every time it was spoken, it was accompanied by the quiet suggestion that Camilla, steady, visible, active, was the only one providing it. The shift wasn't loud. It was a whisper, but a whisper spreading fast. What chilled Catherine most was the realization that these weren't outsiders. These were men and women who had once been pillars of Charles's reign, seasoned advisors, diplomatic, veterans, and friends who had walked the royal path with him for decades. But now, with the king unconscious and the throne adrift, they were aligning behind Camilla's carefully managed rise. Briefing memos began to circulate, suggesting a new structure, one that would preserve order, avoid panic, and ensure seamless leadership. At the center of it was a name: the Council of Stability, and it was Camilla who was being positioned as its natural head. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. But internally, the narrative was being redirected. Leaks began to trickle into the press. Innocuous at first concerns about Charles's long-term recovery, speculation about who might temporarily step in, discussions about the burden of duty. But then, the tone sharpened. Anonymous sources painted William as absent, Catherine as unwilling to lead. It was death by 1,000 headlines. One article even floated the idea that the monarchy required mature steadiness, a phrase later traced back to a Camilla aide with long-standing press ties. Catherine's suspicions turned inward. Was she being deliberately kept in the dark? She reviewed message logs and schedules, only to notice critical health updates from the king's physicians had never reached her directly. Instead, they were routed through Charles's private secretary, a man she had once trusted implicitly. When questioned, his answers were vague, evasive. And that was the tipping point. It was well past midnight when she confronted him, alone in the marble-walled quiet of a lesser-used reception room. Her voice didn't rise, but her words struck like iron. She demanded answers who knew what, when they knew it, and why she had been sidelined. His silence spoke volumes. The truth was clear. Information had been filtered, and not in error. It was controlled, carefully, to isolate her. As she stood there, heart pounding, the phrase that had haunted her since discovering the dossier returned in full force. This isn't ambition, it's a strategy. And then came the final blow. A conversation between two senior aides was inadvertently overheard by a junior staff member. They spoke of a new phrase gaining traction in closed-door meetings. The contingency crown. Not regency. Not interim. Contingency. A crown prepared not for succession, but for replacement. The air around Catherine turned ice cold. But as the shadows closed in, Catherine decided to step out of the dark and into the fire by going public. With her back against the wall, Catherine makes a bold and calculated move, one that would defy centuries of royal protocol. A discreet but deliberate leak to a trusted journalist sets the stage for a shocking counter-narrative. The Princess of Wales was done being silent. She had spent weeks watching the palace machinery turn against her. Every step she took was monitored, every word she spoke was dissected, and every effort to uncover the truth about Camilla's covert operations was met with silence or spin. But Catherine understood something her opponents underestimated: timing. The moment had come to speak, not through declarations or staged appearances, but through the one weapon the palace feared most, a well-placed whisper. The message was sent under an alias, routed through secure channels, and addressed to a single name, a veteran royal correspondent known for integrity and subtlety. The documents weren't complete, but they didn't need to be. Just enough to start a fire. Brief extracts from meeting minutes. Phrases lifted from redacted memos. Quiet references to regency discussions that had no constitutional backing. And, most damning of all, an internal draft of a stability transition prepared for media distribution, where Camilla was named not as consort, but as acting sovereign. Within 48 hours, the story appeared. It was careful, no direct accusations, no confirmed sources, but the implications were thunderous. Unrest in the royal core. Concerns mount over silent power struggle, headlined the morning print. The language danced on the edge of provocation, describing unofficial preparations for regency, palace unease, and an emerging figure whose public poise belies internal turmoil. It didn't name names, but it didn't need to. The public response was immediate and electric. Online forums, tabloids, and international outlets picked up the scent. Hashtags surged: number where is William, number protect the crown, number royals in crisis. For the first time, the narrative slipped from Camilla's control. Questions flooded the press offices. Why had William been so absent from the public eye? Why was Catherine being sidelined despite her steady presence? And why had Camilla's schedule expanded so aggressively in the wake of the king's decline? It wasn't long before a second message surfaced. This time, a carefully worded quote in a private podcast interview Catherine had recorded months earlier but never aired, suddenly found its way to light. Power, she had said, is never truly earned in silence. And in times of illness, we often see who truly seeks it. The quote exploded across platforms. Analysts speculated whether it was coincidence or design. But for those who had been paying attention, it was a signal, a declaration of awareness and defiance. Inside the palace, chaos simmered. Damage control was swift but clumsy. Statements were released, emphasizing unity. Engagements were rescheduled. But none of it could erase the growing suspicion that a silent war had erupted at the monarchy's core. Under pressure, Camilla cancelled 3 high-profile appearances, citing emotional strain, a move many saw as retreat, not rest. But Catherine wasn't finished. She had exposed the cracks, yes, but Camilla was far from defeated. And Catherine knew all too well that when cornered, people make their boldest and most dangerous. plays. But Camilla had one final move, a plan that would cross a line no royal had dared cross in decades. As Charles remained confined to bed, whispers turned to gasps inside Buckingham Palace. A private ceremony, Camilla rehearsing for a coronation without the king. No press, no announcement. Just Camilla, a crown, and a small circle of loyalists behind closed doors. It began with silence. For 3 days, no one could account for Camilla's whereabouts. Her calendar had been cleared without explanation, her public appearances indefinitely postponed, and her aides unusually tight-lipped. But in the heart of Buckingham Palace, something was being prepared not with fanfare or tradition, but with secrecy and precision. Word slipped from chamber to corridor that a transition drill was underway. Few believed it until the evidence arrived in Catherine's hands. A disgruntled aide, once fiercely loyal to the monarchy but increasingly disturbed by the backroom dealings, had recorded footage from a distance. It wasn't polished or theatrical. It wasn't meant to be seen. But the images were unmistakable. Camilla, in full ceremonial robes, stood beneath a replica of the coronation canopy. Her hands cradled the crown, Charles's crown, and beside her, in silent formation, stood figures of influence, legal counsel, senior aides, and a royal chaplain known for his constitutional leniency. It wasn't a practice, it was an audition. Catherine watched the footage in stunned silence, her breath tight in her chest. Every frame pulsed with arrogance and forethought, and it didn't stop there. Accompanying the video were scanned documents, preliminary drafts of emergency legislation, framing a new regency clause. In it, the title Queen Regnant Provisional had been floated, an unprecedented and constitutionally ambiguous phrase that could grant Camilla executive powers in the event of a long-term incapacitation. Not a placeholder, not a steward, a ruler. The words leapt from the page like a dagger. In the interest of stability and continuity of crown function, Her Majesty the Queen Consort shall, upon formal legal invocation, assume sovereign responsibilities. It was no longer an insinuation. It was a move, and it was meant to happen before the public ever had a chance to object. Catherine didn't wait. Within hours, she summoned William, Princess Anne, and the Archbishop of Canterbury to a private, unrecorded emergency session at Windsor. What was discussed behind those doors was never formally documented, but insiders confirmed the tone was urgent and unflinching. The footage was played. The documents were reviewed, and the word that echoed among them all was violation. This wasn't just political maneuvering. It was a breach of every constitutional principle the monarchy had stood upon. William's face, pale with disbelief, reportedly turned grim as he read the clause again and again. Anne, fiercely loyal to the institution, slammed her hand on the table, demanding answers. The Archbishop, caught between faith and law, warned of catastrophic fallout if the Church appeared to endorse such an overreach. No one disagreed. This wasn't just about Camilla anymore, it was about the throne itself. Within days, the phrase constitutional violation began to surface among senior courtiers, not in official statements, but in hushed conversations and late-night strategy calls. The monarchy was fracturing not from outside rebellion, but from an internal power play that had gone too far, too fast. Now armed with irrefutable proof, Catherine knows it's time to confront the monarchy itself. But when Princess Anne and Prince William joined forces with her, the monarchy's silent battle became a three-front rebellion. With each step, the facade of Camilla's quiet takeover began to crack. Anne was the first to stand beside her, not with fanfare, but with steel. The moment she viewed the footage of the coronation rehearsal, her jaw clenched with fury. She had always upheld the rules, even when they cut deep. For Anne, royal duty was sacred, not a game to be played in the shadows. Her voice, usually measured, rang sharp as she declared it an affront to everything their mother had preserved. There was no question of loyalty, it was time to act. William returned just days later, his diplomatic tour cut short by a single coded message from Catherine. When she laid everything before him, the video, the documents, The whispered betrayal etched into the very architecture of the palace. His silence was absolute. He didn't shout, he didn't panic, but his entire posture changed. Camilla had made one grave miscalculation. She believed Charles's heir was too far away to matter. Now, the future king stood at the center of the storm, and he was ready to fight. A private summit was convened at Sandringham, deliberately excluding Camilla and her closest allies. It was not a family meeting, it was a crisis council. For hours, they combed through the Constitution, historic precedents, and regency clauses buried deep in royal protocol. The conclusion was unambiguous. Camilla had no legal authority to initiate or assume regency without joint endorsement from the reigning monarch, the heir, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Parliament. Her rehearsal had not only been unconstitutional, it had been an attempted subversion of lawful succession. They knew the threat could no longer remain confined to whispers. Catherine began drafting a formal report addressed directly to the Prime Minister. It was detailed, precise, and damning. The evidence was catalogued, the footage time-stamped, the documents authenticated. It was the first move toward involving the government and the first signal that the palace could no longer contain the crisis on its own. Once the report was submitted, there would be no turning back. Outside the palace walls, the world was beginning to sense the fracture. Journalists, once bound by embargoes and fear, began to probe deeper. Headlines shifted from cautious speculation to outright alarm. Royal succession in turmoil. Power struggle behind the throne. Public unrest brewed beneath the surface. Commentators dissected Catherine's every word, William's sudden return, Anne's unexpected silence. Rumours became currency. The nation began to question not just who was in charge, but who had betrayed their trust. Inside the monarchy, the temperature continued to rise. Alliances hardened, trust disintegrated. Even neutral figures were forced to choose a side, and in the eye of it all stood three figures: Catherine, William, and Anne, bound not by convenience, but by conviction. But as they prepared to expose Camilla to the world, an unexpected twist put everything at risk. In a stunning turn of fate, the king begins to recover just as the final moves of the power game unfold. But his return brings more questions than answers. Would Charles side with his wife? Or with the woman defending the crown's integrity? The news came quietly. A whisper from the royal physician passed along a guarded corridor, reaching only the ears of those who had waited weeks for a sign. Charles was conscious. Not fully, not steadily, but awake. And in that fragile sliver of lucidity, the storm that had engulfed the palace paused not out of resolution, but because the eye had opened. Catherine felt a flood of emotions collide inside her relief, dread, urgency. The king's awakening could be the end of the crisis, or the beginning of something far worse. Word spread rapidly. Camilla moved first. With practiced swiftness, she entered the king's recovery chamber, armed with her version of events. To Charles, weakened and disoriented, she painted a narrative of control and sacrifice. She had stepped in, she insisted, only to prevent chaos. The monarchy had teetered on the edge, and in his absence, someone had to shield the institution. Her actions, she claimed, were not about ambition, they were about duty. She invoked tradition, invoked loyalty, invoked fear, but she left out the crown rehearsals, the drafted regency legislation, the silent coup that had nearly unfolded under his name. William and Catherine waited, not with idle hope, but with evidence. The dossier was ready: timelines, correspondences, transcripts, and footage. William delivered it personally, placing it in his father's hands with a single sentence: "You deserve to know what happened in your name." Then he stepped back. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about clarity. Charles read in silence. Catherine, summoned alone into his presence, found herself staring into the face of a man torn in two. His voice was hoarse, his eyes clouded, but the weight in the room was undeniable. No aides, no handlers, no Camilla. Just the king and the woman who had fought to preserve the very throne beneath him. She didn't speak of betrayal. She didn't plead. Instead, she told to him what the nation had not been told, what almost became law behind locked doors, what power had been grabbed, and what legacy had nearly been rewritten. For days, Charles remained silent. No statements were made, no corrections issued. Even palace insiders were shut out, unsure of where the king stood or what he would do. Camilla kept close to his chambers. William retreated into strategy. Catherine waited, knowing the weight of the monarchy now rested on a single decision. The palace had become a pressure cooker every hour without a verdict, stoking speculation, fear, and fury. Would Charles protect his wife, or would he restore the balance she had disrupted? And then, the summons came, a rare joint family assembly called not by the advisors nor the press team, but by Charles himself. The last time such a meeting had occurred, the Queen was alive and the family was united. Now, it would be something else entirely. And what he says next will not only change the power dynamics, it will fracture the family forever. After days of palace lockdown, King Charles finally speaks. His address, broadcast unexpectedly across the nation, unveils everything: the illness, the betrayal, and the startling decision that would shock both the monarchy and the people. The announcement came without warning. Just after dusk, the royal insignia appeared on national screens, interrupting regular programming. For the first time since the crisis began, the king himself took center stage, not through intermediaries or carefully worded statements, but in his own solemn voice. His face bore the weight of recovery and reckoning. The nation held its breath. Charles began with gratitude, to the doctors, to the nation, and to his family. But the tone shifted quickly, tightening with the force of truth long withheld. He acknowledged the silence of the past weeks, not as weakness, but as observation. While he lay incapacitated, he said, choices had been made without his consent. Actions had been taken, in his name, that did not reflect his will. Then came the words that would ricochet through the palace halls for decades. There was an unauthorized shift in protocol. With calm but unmistakable authority, Charles laid bare the events that had been hidden behind royal curtains. He did not name Camilla directly, but his meaning was unmistakable. He declared that no individual, regardless of title or influence, had the authority to claim or act on sovereign power without collective consent from the crown, the heir, parliament, and the church. His voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. It was final, unquestionable, and devastating in its clarity. The next decree was swift and public. Effective immediately, Queen Camilla would step back from all ceremonial duties, indefinitely. No further explanation, no apologies, just a pause and a reckoning. Her silence in the aftermath would speak louder than any prepared statement ever could. What had been poised as a quiet coronation, rehearsal had now become a national scandal. Support for Catherine surged. Across social media, newsrooms, and private living rooms, people rallied behind the woman who had protected the monarchy from within. Newspapers hailed her as the silent shield of the crown. The British press dubbed it the day the monarchy was saved. For once, the palace was not defined by tradition, but by accountability. In the days that followed, the monarchy implemented sweeping procedural reforms. New succession protocols were introduced. Emergency regency processes were rewritten with unprecedented transparency. Catherine's role, once whispered about behind closed doors, became central to the institution's future vision. She hadn't asked for power, but her strength had redrawn the lines of it. As for Camilla, she disappeared from public view. Retreating to a private estate, she issued no denial, no rebuttal. Her silence became its own admission. The woman who had nearly rewritten the monarchy's path now found herself erased from the corridors she once tried to claim. But in the quiet aftermath, Catherine discovers one final letter, one that rewrites everything they thought they knew. Hidden deep within a locked drawer in Camilla's private study was a letter addressed to Charles, never sent, never spoken. Its contents hint at a deeper fear, a desperate love, and a chilling glimpse into Camilla's true intentions. Was it ambition, or something far more tragic? The palace was quiet in the aftermath. Days had passed since the king's public declaration, and Clarence House had been left largely untouched, its corridors hollowed by absence, its rooms thick with unfinished stories. Catherine, accompanied only by a single aide, stepped through the estate not out of curiosity, but necessity. Legal teams had begun formal archiving, cataloguing every document left behind in the wake of Camilla's withdrawal from public life. It was during this subdued walkthrough that Catherine opened a drawer none had dared disturb. And there, placed deliberately under a stack of old diaries, was the envelope. Cream-coloured, handwritten, unopened. Her name wasn't on it, but Charles's was etched in Camilla's unmistakable script, fragile and trembling. The seal had never been broken. She hesitated, then read. What spilled out was not the voice of a scheming queen, but of a woman unravelling. The letter didn't argue. It didn't defend. It confessed. Camilla's words were raw, almost fevered. She wrote of fear, not of scandal or shame, but of erasure, of disappearing into the folds of history as a footnote. Not a queen, not even a consort, just a complication. She believed the monarchy would never accept her fully, that the nation saw her not as part of the royal lineage, but as its fracture. I was never the crown's choice, she wrote, and I was never yours without conditions. Then came the most haunting passage. A dream, repeated, vivid, and disturbing. In it, she stood in Westminster Abbey beneath the weight of the crown, cloaked in silence, while Charles lay behind her lifeless, entombed. She described the hush of the crowd, the way their eyes stared through her, the way the crown seemed to burn against her skin. She wrote, I woke up weeping, but not because you were gone, because for once, I was seen. Catherine felt the weight of the line, the horror behind it, the longing entangled with guilt. She read on. Camilla questioned whether her push for power had truly been about Charles or about herself, whether the quiet steps she'd taken were born from duty or desperation. And in the final sentence, barely legible, written in a shaky hand, was the confession no royal statement would ever admit aloud. I only wanted to matter. Catherine folded the letter slowly, sealing it again, but not to hide it, to preserve it. Because whatever had happened in the public eye, whatever consequences the nation would remember, the truth within that letter could never be shared in a press release or public archive. It was too human, too broken, too real, and with that, the war for the crown was over, but its wounds would remain forever etched into the House of Windsor. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We will see you in the next one.